Police searched the residence of Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law after investigators discovered the missing woman's necklace nearby. However, the lead proved fleeting and vanished quickly, with the scene showing signs of tampering or deliberate staging. Meanwhile, a viral video circulating online showed a six-fingered figure in Savannah footage, potentially linked to the case itself. Questions shifted suspicion toward those closest to her.
Nancy Guthrie's son-in-law, Tomaso Chion, has been getting a lot of attention in the Nancy Guthrie disappearance case, as he was reportedly the last one to see her. Now new footage has been released in Guthrie's alleged kidnapping. The FBI released clips from her camera, which showed a masked figure at the doorway. The first look at the potential suspect in Guthrie's case has led to renewed interest in Chion. Several people took screen grabs from the video footage and images released by the FBI and placed them alongside Chion's photos.
Getting a glimpse of the possible culprit instantly reignited intense scrutiny surrounding Gianni. Web sleuths started putting still shots from the Bureau's newly dropped tapes side by side with his personal pictures. Throughout all of this, he kept his mouth completely shut for weeks. He stayed quiet when cops showed up at his house, remained tight-lipped when the feds put out the video, and did not utter a word even as his name dominated national television screens. He refused to speak even while his own relatives begged for any shred of information on live television. Nancy Guthrie went missing under the cover of darkness on February 1st, 2026. In a chilling twist, her heart implant was physically removed and abandoned. Surveillance equipment throughout the house was completely destroyed, while a faint path of Crimson guided investigators straight to the rear exit of her Tucson property. As for the final individual known to be in her presence, he immediately hired an attorney and refused to cooperate. That is, until right now. Because today, following countless weeks of wild theories, intense, glaring, and heavy media scrutiny, the man at the center of the storm is finally speaking out. The details he just admitted completely flip the script on whatever we assumed took place behind those closed doors. Yet, before diving into his actual statement, it is crucial to grasp exactly why his refusal to talk was such a massive red flag. We are not looking at your run-of-the-mill cold case. We are talking about an 84-year-old grandmother, a widow who had spent decades weaving herself into the local fabric, and the mom of an incredibly famous national reporter. She spent over 80 years radiating kindness, strength, and dedication, only for her peaceful existence to turn into a terrifying active investigation on that winter evening. For those tuning in for the first time, glad to have you. We skip the sensational gossip and dig straight for the hard facts. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because these mysteries do not wrap up just because the media moves on. They only finish when justice is served. All right. Let us rewind to day 1, February 1st, 2026, down in Tucson, Arizona. Nancy was relaxing in the exact same house she had called her own for decades, nestled inside a sleepy subdivision where trouble basically never brewed. Pushing 84, she definitely did not get around as fast as she used to, yet her mind remained incredibly quick. She held firmly onto her autonomy, stayed deeply involved with her congregation at St. Philip's in the Hills Episcopal Church, and talked constantly with her 5 kids. She survived her late spouse, Charles Guthrie, after he passed away back in 1988. Handling the single life with pure class, she spent a huge chunk of her career holding down an administrative role over at the University of Arizona. While she never had millions in the bank or a recognizable face, she was a deeply beloved neighborhood fixture and someone who required severe medical care. Specifically, she relied on an electronic pulse generator embedded beneath her skin to keep her ticker beating properly. Take that away, and her vitals would spiral out of control. Losing that machine put her in immediate mortal danger. Keep that specific fact in mind, because it is the linchpin of this entire mystery. Later that night, the man married to her daughter, Tomaso Chion, pulled up to the property. Ride-share receipts eventually verified that he dropped by. They shared a meal together, and based on the brief comments released by his legal team, it was just a regular, boring catch-up. Absolutely nothing felt out of the ordinary, just normal relative bonding. A couple of hours passed, and he grabbed another ride out of there. That left the elderly woman completely by herself. Once the sun came up, she had vanished into thin air. Whoever checked on the property the following day walked into a scene that screamed foul play. The rear entryway was left wide open, and every single piece of indoor surveillance equipment had been beaten to pieces. Nancy's internal heart monitor was violently ripped out and tossed onto the ground, and a narrow streak of deep red painted a track from the living area straight out the back patio. Strangely, nothing was shattered to get inside, no deadbolts were busted open, and creepiest of all, her pet pup never made a single sound. Whoever crept into that house was either invited through the front door or already owned a set of keys. First responders rushed to the address. Tucson cops locked down the perimeter while crime scene techs started bagging up physical evidence. Federal authorities were looped in right off the bat. Before the day was even over, a single burning thought consumed the entire task force. Who had the final conversation with this woman before she went missing? The obvious answer was Tomaso Chion. On top of that, he held full legal control over all of her money. Basically, he had the green light to move her cash and handle her estate. Honestly, that setup is pretty standard stuff. Tons of households draw up similar paperwork when older folks start slipping. However, mix that kind of access with a bloody crime scene, and suddenly, it looks incredibly suspicious. Detectives immediately reached out to bring him in for questioning. Tomaso lawyered up, flat out refusing to talk, while hiding behind his Fifth Amendment protections. Sure, he was well within his legal bounds to do so. In the court of public opinion, though, it was a terrible look. The longer things dragged on, the more everyone assumed he was guilty. The FBI eventually put out some blurry security video from Nancy's front door, revealing someone creeping up to the house in the dark, completely covered in a mask and gloves. Whoever it was didn't hesitate. Every single step was calculated and purposeful. Moments later, the surveillance equipment was completely smashed to pieces. A trio of extortion letters popped up asking for Bitcoin, but authorities quickly figured out they were just the work of a grifter looking to cash in on the tragedy. It ended up being nothing more than a sick goose chase. Meanwhile, Border Patrol temporarily nabbed Tomaso down in Rio Rico, Arizona, right near the Mexico crossing. Law enforcement raided several places tied to his name, confiscating his devices, bagging up his clothes for testing, and tearing through his bank statements. Even with all that digging, the cops could not pin anything on him, and his lips remained firmly sealed. Around the same time, Nancy's daughter, NBC Today Show co-host Savannah Guthrie, stepped up to the podium. She wasn't there to report the news. She was there as a heartbroken child looking for her mom. Shaking with emotion, she begged the public for any clues, eventually stepping away from her television gig entirely. To sweeten the pot, her relatives put up a $50,000 bounty. Federal agents matched that chunk of change penny for penny. Soon, Nancy's picture was plastered on massive signs all over Arizona, staring down at every major freeway and crosswalk with an unspoken plea. Everyone was wondering what on earth happened to her. Days bled into weeks, and then months, making the lack of answers feel absolutely suffocating. Just when the trail went cold, a massive breakthrough happened. Detectives took a second, much closer look at the digital footprint left by Nancy's medical heart device. These newer implants track absolutely everything from pulse rates and panic indicators to exact dates and times of cardiac events. Because of those internal logs, authorities were able to pinpoint the exact second the machine was shut off. Detectives lined up that crucial moment with his rideshare receipts, smartphone locations, and cell tower signals. Word leaked from the precinct that the timelines were completely off. Away from the prying eyes of the press, detectives laid out their secret evidence right on the table in front of Tomaso's defense squad. Right on the heels of that intense meeting, a press conference was abruptly put on the books, catching everyone completely off guard. He had kept his mouth shut for what felt like an eternity, sticking to his no-comment strategy. Yet there he sat, flanked by his lawyer in a claustrophobic room packed with journalists, ready to break his silence. "I had nothing to do with taking Nancy." He kicked things off, causing a hush to fall over the crowd. "I never intended to hurt her," he added, letting the words hang in the air. But something definitely went down that night. That single phrase, those few simple words, completely blew up the storyline the entire country had already accepted as fact. Through his official remarks, he painted a picture of the night of February 1st that was anything but normal. He detailed a heated argument where Nancy threw a massive curveball, telling him she was tweaking her estate plan to essentially cut off his access to her cash. While he admitted it pissed him off, he swore he never laid a hand on her, claiming he simply walked out the door and used his rideshare receipts as rock-solid proof. Next came the bombshell confession. Once he got back to his place, his phone rang. It was Nancy, and she sounded terrified. Something was terribly off. So he headed right back to her place, only this time he did not use an app to get there. He insisted he took his personal ride, pointing out that the cops had only been looking into his paid transit history up until that point. Law enforcement had managed to keep his car's navigation history completely under wraps. According to his story, he walked in to find Nancy collapsed on the ground, bleeding, which sent him into an absolute tailspin. Rather than dialing 911 for help, he admitted to making a wildly disastrous call. He supposedly ripped out her pacemaker, thinking the device was glitching and making her sick. Medical examiners, however, shot down that theory almost instantly. Even so, Tomaso kept talking, swearing up and down that she was still alive and taking breaths when he bolted from the house a second time. He fiercely denied snatching her away, claiming that by the time he swung by again, she had vanished into thin air. He did, however, fess up to wrecking the security system. He owned up to keeping his mouth shut about the whole ordeal and intentionally leaving out key details. But he drew a hard line at being called a killer. The public fallout was absolute dynamite. Armchair detectives and courtroom experts alike labeled his words a half-confession that was going to carry some heavy-duty blowback. The district attorney's office immediately started weighing their options for throwing the book at him. They were looking at everything from getting in the way of a police investigation and destroying proof to flat-out manslaughter. Nancy's relatives put out a super-calculated press release, nodding to this massive update while driving home the fact that they still had zero clue where she actually was. Savannah was noticeably absent from the morning broadcast. It marked the very first moment in the entire case where the official sequence of events got a major overhaul. Suddenly, it was an indisputable fact that he had gone back to the property a second time. Plus, they finally had him on tape admitting he wrecked the surveillance setup. He had essentially admitted to a frantic, panic-fueled cover-up. Yet, there was still no corpse to be found, nor any solid medical reason for how she died. On top of that, nobody could explain the creepy guy in the disguise. Was it just Tomaso doubling back, or was there a total wild card involved? Crime lab experts are currently tearing through the evidence files with a fresh perspective, analyzing the blood droplets, the car routes, the digital phone trails, and those crucial cardiac logs all over again. The fact that the family pet never made a peep suddenly makes a whole lot of sense if the person sneaking in was already a friendly face. Finding absolutely no broken locks or busted windows perfectly tracks with the idea that Nancy let her killer inside. Still, there is one massive piece of the puzzle that nobody has figured out yet. Assuming Nancy survived his second departure, where did things go from there? Did she try to drag herself out of the residence despite her injuries? Did a totally different individual show up? Could she have stumbled blindly into the dark desert landscape in a state of deep confusion? Or are we dealing with a completely unknown third party who hasn't been identified yet? At the time of this broadcast, the state hasn't filed any official indictments. Yet the focus of the inquiry has shifted far past simple stonewalling. Now, it hinges entirely on an admission of guilt. And an admission flips the entire script. We are way beyond theorizing about potential suspects at this point. The new objective is figuring out the exact nature of the crime committed. Nancy Guthrie, remains completely unfound. We are talking about an 84-year-old mother suffering from cardiac issues, a grandmother, and a pillar of her neighborhood. Vanishing without a trace, she inadvertently highlighted deep flaws in familial trust, journalistic integrity, the speed of legal proceedings, and elder care protocols. But it also brought another grim reality to light. Keeping your mouth shut might keep you out of prison, but the court of public opinion will tear you apart. Plus, whenever that quiet spell finally snaps, it never just snaps neatly, it shatters into jagged pieces. Anyone holding clues regarding Nancy Guthrie's location is urged to reach out to either the Tucson authorities or federal agents immediately. The bounty of $100,000 is still very much active and up for grabs. Do not discount minor hints, because the ultimate truth is absolutely out there waiting to be found, maybe inside a trial hall, out amidst the barren sands, or buried deep within ignored cyber data. Nancy's narrative is far from finished. The inquiry pushes forward, and our team plans to track every single twist until the facts are totally whole, undisputed, and out in the open. After all, finding true accountability requires much more than just keeping quiet. It absolutely requires transparency, and Nancy Guthrie is owed exactly that level of respect. Once again, breaking that quiet streak is never a smooth process. It splinters straight down the structural weaknesses that existed from day one. To the general public, the sequence of events for February 1st, 2026, looked incredibly straightforward for a really long time. Tomaso rolled up to Nancy Guthrie's Tucson residence in a rideshare vehicle. They ate a meal together. He subsequently headed out in another rideshare. Then, just past midnight, a disguised individual walked up to the property. Security lenses got smashed. Nancy vanished into thin air. That was the narrative fed to the masses. However, his recent admission about heading back to the house later that evening completely torpedoes that original chronology. The moment a chain of events falls apart, detectives are forced to reconstruct the entire night, literally second by second. Going off his freshly published account, though, he initially exited Nancy's place close to 9:47 in the evening. Rideshare logs definitely back up that claim. Satellite tracking proves the car pulled up to his own address just after 10:05 at night. We always had that piece of the puzzle. The missing variable was whatever went down immediately afterward. Exactly at 10:32 at night, Nancy's cell dialed his number. They stayed on the line for exactly 47 seconds. Detectives possessed that specific log from day one, yet the actual contents of the conversation remained a total mystery until recently. He never offered any context for it, nor did anyone in the press ever press him on the issue. It just sat there as an ignored detail buried in legally acquired cell documents. Fast forward to today, and he insists the call consisted of Nancy begging him to return. According to his story, she came across as disoriented, gasping for air, and highly panicked. He alleges that he paused to think, then hopped behind the wheel himself, ditching the rideshare app entirely. Which kicks off the deeply concerning latter portion of the evening. Tech experts have subsequently verified that his personal automobile's internal computer connected with a local radio mast, placing him right on track, heading straight back into Nancy's subdivision between 10:50 and 11:05 at night. That specific tracking information was deliberately kept out of the headlines early on. The cops were holding on to it as a trump card. This secondary drive completely shifts the paradigm, forcing everyone to take a completely different look at the disguised person caught on the porch camera just shy of midnight. Could that have been him all along? The tape depicts a suspect wearing all black apparel and hand protection, completely hiding their facial features. Experts calculate the subject's stature to be somewhere in the ballpark of 5'9" and 6'1". For the record, he stands exactly 5'11". The intruder walks with intense purpose, showing zero signs of rushing or hesitation. They head toward the flank of the property initially, before circling back to the main doorway, which is right where the lenses get smashed. Assuming he actually was the one heading back inside, what was the point of hiding his face? His documented excuse is sheer anxiety. He claims he was desperate to avoid the neighbors spotting him returning following the spat they had earlier. He further states the hand protection was strictly to avoid leaving fingerprints behind during something he brushed off as a private domestic dispute. The district attorney's office hasn't offered any official comment regarding that specific defense. So, let's trace the steps of this supposedly peaceful return trip. Based on his version of events, he strolled right in through the lateral entrance. No broken locks were involved, since he already possessed the means to get inside. Crime scene techs actually corroborated that specific fact. He alleges that he walked in to find Nancy collapsed in the main sitting room. He spotted bodily fluids. It wasn't exactly a massive puddle, but definitely a sufficient amount of blood to spark sheer terror. Forensics eventually concluded that those exact crimson drops aligned more closely with a body in motion rather than a heavy, violent strike. A distinctive wipe mark strongly hinted at someone dragging against the hardwood before shifting positions directly into the corridor. Then there's the issue of the medical device in her chest. This is the exact moment his narrative raises major red flags. He insists that he witnessed Nancy gripping her torso tightly while struggling for every single breath. According to his account, he was under the impression her heart implant had stopped working properly. Doctors and specialists have made it completely clear on the record. Ripping out a cardiac device anywhere besides an operating room makes absolutely zero sense during a heart emergency. Even so, he fully confesses to unhooking the machine himself. It wasn't some precise medical procedure either. He claims he just yanked it out, and investigators eventually discovered the severed equipment lying on the ground. Today's medical implants act like black boxes, and detectives pulled the logs. At exactly 11:17 p.m., NY's pulse skyrocketed. 1 minute later, at 11:18 p.m., irregular heartbeats registered on the monitor. By 11:19 p.m., all signals abruptly cut to black, a precise moment that perfectly matches up with when Tomaso admits he was standing right there. He maintains she was still taking breaths even after the machine went offline, claiming he just completely lost his head. Rather than dialing 911, his mind supposedly raced straight to the fallout, obsessing over their prior chat regarding her will. He worried intensely about the optics of her dropping dead right on the heels of their massive fight. He knew the cops would point the finger squarely at him, and that exact chain of thought is what detectives are heavily scrutinizing right now. While freaking out might excuse someone freezing up, it absolutely doesn't justify wrecking the house. Tomaso has already owned up to destroying the surveillance setup. His excuse is that he didn't want the footage taken out of context. The problem is, law enforcement almost never views tampering with a crime scene as a simple panic response. To them, it looks like a clear-cut cover-up. Crime scene techs analyzing the broken camera shells found strike marks from something heavy and blunt, pointing heavily toward the iron hearth tool they later recovered in the parking bay. However, lab results couldn't nail down a perfect fingerprint match to Tomaso, strongly hinting that the perpetrator wore hand protection. Then there's the trail of blood. Authorities currently theorize that Nancy was actually somewhat mobile on her own 2 feet, even after her life-saving implant was torn out. The blood drop analysis paints a picture of someone stumbling and swaying down the corridor toward the back of the house. Yet one massive lingering doubt keeps popping up over and over. If she was still breathing and walking past 11:19 p.m., where exactly did she vanish to? Tomaso alleges that by roughly 11:30 p.m., Nancy went completely mute. He claims he felt for a heartbeat, found absolutely nothing, and was utterly convinced she had passed away before he walked out the front door. What he completely fails to justify, though, is why he left the rear exit wide open, or why he never bothered to get paramedics on the line. He asserts that upon popping back into the residence a bit later, her body was simply missing a quick visit that police haven't been able to back up with hard proof yet. That open rear entry point had zero evidence of a breakout. lacking any scuffs or pulling patterns that weren't already accounted for indoors. Canine units managed to follow NY's smell right up to the property line out back before hitting a complete dead end, throwing a massive curveball that detectives simply cannot ignore right now. Could an unknown third party have hauled Nancy away once Tomaso took off? Or is it possible she stumbled outside in bad shape and dropped somewhere hidden? Out in the Tucson area, the harsh Arizona desert is notorious for erasing clues in a flash. It's an absolutely massive expanse of land where wild animals make searching incredibly difficult. And as of today, a body still hasn't turned up. The tech footprint throws in a whole new twist. Tower logs reveal NY's cell went completely dead at 11:26 p.m., and it hasn't connected to a network a single time since. Meanwhile, Tomaso's own mobile device went totally dark between 12 midnight and 6:14 a.m. Law enforcement is keeping quiet on whether the phone was actually shut down, put on flight mode, or if he was simply sleeping. At this point, we need to talk about the possible reasons behind all this. Looking back at that argument over her assets, reports indicate Nancy was gearing up to rewrite her trust and significantly cut off Tomaso's access to her money. In fact, she had an appointment on the books to sit down with her lawyer just a few days later. Bank statements don't highlight any fast cash grabs or shady account draining leading up to the night she vanished. However, when it comes to domestic cases, the trigger usually isn't about scoring a quick payday, it's the sheer terror of losing what you already have. The district attorney's office has a huge hurdle, proving that those upcoming changes to her financial documents were both massive and right around the corner. Savannah Guthrie, along with the rest of the relatives, are keeping their lips sealed regarding the exact details of the inheritance. Meanwhile, Tomaso's spouse, who is also NY's kid, Annie, hasn't spoken a single word to the press since releasing that initial memo. Legal experts monitoring the situation believe getting hit with obstruction charges is practically guaranteed at this point. He's all but locked in for evidence tampering since he already confessed to smashing the video system. But slapping him with a murder rap hinges entirely on figuring out exactly what killed her. Lacking a physical corpse forces the state to build their entire prosecution on indirect clues and hospital-grade diagnostics. Those readouts from the heart implant definitely prove someone messed with it, but they absolutely do not prove it was the cause of death. Given NY's advanced years and failing heart, making it through without the machine running is highly doubtful, though science says it's technically doable for brief periods. Those unaccounted for moments right after the wires were pulled represent the absolute biggest missing piece of the puzzle. Detectives are actively running the security clips of that disguised individual through cutting-edge, high-tech physical mapping software. Movement specialists are breaking down the person's stride, while technicians work on calculating exact bodily dimensions from the video. Should that hidden face belong to Tomaso? The cover-up screams premeditated guilt. But if it turns out to be a total stranger, this entire investigation is about to blow wide open. At present, authorities are playing it close to the vest. Tomaso came clean about making a follow-up trip to the residence. He confessed to unhooking the heart device and smashing the surveillance system. Yet he swears he didn't murder Nancy. And her whereabouts remain a complete mystery. Chapter 1 of this story doesn't offer any neat resolutions. Instead, we are left with a far more sinister sequence of events, given the newly discovered second trip. It is an established fact that the cardiac monitor was pulled off at exactly 11:19 p.m., just as we know the security feeds were purposely wrecked. We are certain 911 was never dialed. Furthermore, following that exact evening, Nancy completely dropped off the face of the earth. Liars are forced to constantly keep their fabricated tales straight, whereas physical proof never has to rely on memory. It just states the facts. When it comes to Nancy Guthrie vanishing, this silent, objective, and cold data might serve as the sole bystander, immune to threats, manipulation, or prompting. Following Tomaso's official declaration acknowledging that he went back to Nancy's property along with his confession regarding the disabled heart implant and smashed video lenses. Detectives completely pivoted their investigation. Law enforcement was no longer trying to figure out if he had made a comeback trip. The real mystery shifted to the exact events unfolding between 10:50 p.m. and midnight. That specific time frame, lasting slightly more than 60 minutes, likely holds the key to distinguishing a frantic mistake from premeditated action. We should begin by looking at the most heavily incriminating piece of scientific proof: Nancy's cardiac device. Today's heart implants aren't just sitting there idly. They actively track information and monitor pulse patterns. These gadgets register electrical impulses down to the exact second. A few models go as far as noting abrupt shocks or unusual bodily strain. Once experts pulled the information from Nancy's unit, they successfully pieced together the last known heartbeat sequences. Exactly at 11:16 and 42 seconds p.m., her pulse spiked dramatically. By 11:17 and 8 seconds p.m., erratic heartbeat rhythms kicked in. Then, at 11:18 and 51 seconds p.m., the logs showed severe ventricular instability. At exactly 11:19 and 3 seconds p.m., the machine registered a sudden loss of connection. That ultimate tracking moment, 11:19 and 3 seconds p.m., doesn't merely represent a mechanical failure. It points directly to an intentional, physical tampering. Medical experts analyzing the readout determined that the implant hadn't simply broken down on its own. Someone violently severed its connection. This specific detail throws a massive wrench into Tomaso's version of events. Had Nancy been awake and moving around at 11:19 p.m., tearing out that monitor would have triggered instant agony, massive cardiovascular trauma, intense lightheadedness, and a highly probable blackout. However, experts studying the fluid splatters found evidence of relocation following that exact minute, bringing up a massive scientific discrepancy. Forensics teams dedicated weeks to mapping out the crimson stains left behind in Nancy's house. These spots didn't come from a violent burst. They found absolutely zero signs of a swinging weapon arc or high-pressure circulatory spurts. Rather, the authorities discovered a smudge right by the lounge area carpet, incomplete shoe impressions, lines of drips heading into the corridor, and a very light contact stain by the back exit frame. Stain experts concluded that the victim was probably on her feet or at least elevated shortly following the first wound. Those tracks point to someone helping her walk, or her stumbling along on her own. Yet the actual fluid volume was quite small, leading to three potential theories. The first is that the wound didn't kill her right away. Second, the hemorrhaging happened completely inside her body. And third, someone actually tried to scrub the mess away. Chemical spray checks brought up subtle, wiped spots right along the lower wall trim. They were faint and unfinished, yet definitely there. If the suspect freaked out and smashed the surveillance gear, is it possible he also tried to mop up the area? He completely rejects that accusation, though the authorities are still keeping it on the table. Once he confessed to steering his own car back to the victim's property, law enforcement legally demanded his vehicle's digital tracking logs. Today's automobiles hold on to a downright shocking volume of electronic intelligence. Things like satellite tracking, velocity records, exact moments of handles being pulled, ignition fires, and even passenger cushion pressure. The computer showed his motor cranked at 10:46 p.m. The mapping system marks him pulling up to her block at 11:02 p.m., with the motor shutting down at 11:04 p.m. That car sat completely dead until 11:37 p.m., firing back up right at 11:38 p.m. However, that 34-minute parked block lines up perfectly with the cardiac unit's last ping at 11:19 p.m. This proves he was standing right inside that house the exact second the implant lost power, a detail he has already confessed to. Yet, detectives are currently zeroing in on another specific anomaly. Right at 11:38 p.m., the moment the car was cranked again, the computer tracks map out a brief diversion before he drove home. That little side trip took exactly 6 minutes. Satellite positioning pinned the truck right by an arid ravine under 2 miles away from Nancy's place. Police have already combed through that spot. They turned up empty-handed, yet this scenic route still lacks a solid justification in his police interview. He insists he was just cruising to calm his nerves. The district attorney's office is keeping quiet for now, while the FBI's touched-up video of that masked person walking toward Nancy's house is still sparking intense debate. Once Tomaso confessed to going back a second time, specialists in walking patterns got involved. These analysts scrutinized everything from how the arms moved and the length of each step to the way the shoulders were held, and even the angle of the head. Their initial takeaway? The person's stride definitely matches up with Tomaso's usual walk. Yet, it is not a slam dunk. Simply put, he is a solid match, but that video alone isn't enough to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Experts guess the masked individual stands somewhere between 5 foot 10 inches and 6 feet tall. Tomaso clocks in at exactly 5 foot 11 inches. However, the gloves they had on make it impossible to judge hand size. They wore totally standard clothes with zero branding or distinct features. Though one specific thing did catch everyone's eye. Whoever is under that mask seems to stop for a split second right by the lens right before knocking it offline. They do not look startled, but rather like they are just double-checking where it is. That strongly points to someone who knows their way around the property. Nancy's dog never made a peep, leading detectives to believe the break-in was committed by a familiar face. Nancy's cell died at 11:26 p.m., and tower records show zero activity after that. Meanwhile, Tomaso's device went totally dark between 11:41 p.m. and 6:14 a.m. Authorities still are not sure if that radio silence just means he was sleeping, if he flipped on airplane mode, or if he purposely turned the thing off. That said, cyber experts point out that suspects frequently power down their gadgets when committing a crime. Doing so completely kills any location tracking and cuts down on digital footprints. Even so, a lack of information does not automatically equal guilt. It is just a blank space. Right now, forensic accountants are tearing through Nancy's will and trust paperwork. Files show she actually booked a sit-down with her lawyer for February 3rd, which was just 2 days after she vanished. Early versions of those updates hint that she was planning to dial back someone's money control rather than cut them off entirely. In the eyes of the law, that little detail is huge. A motive needs to make sense. Was Tomaso about to go broke? Not at all. Was he about to lose his grip on the purse strings? Very likely. You do not need to be desperate to have a motive. You just need to feel threatened. That quick pit stop his car made by the dry riverbed kicked off a massive manhunt. Search teams brought in scent hounds. They ran radar deep into the dirt in targeted areas and flew drones looking for freshly dug patches. They came up empty, but the desert landscape changes in a heartbeat. Heavy gusts erase tracks, and scavengers scatter evidence. Detectives are keeping that spot firmly on their radar. Yet the biggest hurdle for the crime lab, the absolute core issue here, has not gone away. They still have not found a victim. Without physical remains, medical examiners are totally stuck. They cannot pinpoint how she died, when it happened, or if she passed away in her house versus somewhere else. The readings from her heart implant definitely point to a massive medical emergency. However, an emergency does not guarantee she died right then. Nancy might have passed out and been relocated later, or she could have stumbled outside in a daze. Then again, that idea completely clashes with what the tracking hounds found and the fact that her scent just stopped. State attorneys are framing their entire argument around one major question. Did the suspect smash those lenses out of sheer panic, or was it a cold, calculated cover-up? Freaking out creates chaos and leaves a sloppy scene behind. It rarely looks like a systematic takedown of several security feeds. Premeditation leaves a clear blueprint. Whoever took out those cameras hit them with absolute precision. The fact that the garage shut several days prior is still incredibly shady, and that weird driving route makes zero sense. Despite all this, Tomaso willingly started talking. This throws a massive wrench into the state's game plan, since guilty people hardly ever confess to a piece of the crime unless they think the walls are closing in completely. Did the cops back him into a corner with rock-solid proof, forcing him to admit just enough to save face? Or is he playing chess, trying to spin the story before any handcuffs come out? Every criminal probe eventually hits a wall where the what-ifs fade away and the hard legal battles begin. For a while, Nancy Guthrie's missing person case was stuck in limbo, caught somewhere between gut feelings and hard evidence, between public anger and criminal charges. But the moment Tomaso Chion came clean, admitting he went back to the property, messed with Nancy's medical device, wrecked the security setup, and never bothered calling 911, that limbo practically vanished. In private meetings, the legal team stopped wondering if a crime actually took place. Instead, they started figuring out exactly which criminal statutes matched his confession. They secretly pulled together a grand jury down in Puma County, keeping the press and flashing bulbs far away, focusing solely on the facts. They looked at the heart monitor logs, the car's GPS history, the blood spatter reports, the suspicious phone shutoffs, the weird garage situation from earlier in the week, that random side trip out by the dry creek bed, and the biggest smoking gun they had, Tomaso's very own statement. Lawyers who study true crime trends believe the state is staring down a massive turning point right now. Trying a murder case without a victim is insanely tough, but it certainly can be done. Ultimately, the state has to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Nancy Guthrie is dead and that Tomaso's actions are the direct cause of her passing. Information recovered from her heart device points toward a deliberately caused, potentially fatal disruption. Medical professionals already took the stand, explaining that violently yanking out a heart monitor can cause a deadly irregular heartbeat almost instantly. The defense team is bound to push back, insisting that timing isn't solid proof, and they'll claim she might have stayed alive just long enough to wander off the property. Their main argument will be that freaking out isn't the same as killing someone, which forced the state to start casting a wider net. If a homicide charge won't stick, prosecutors might push for a lesser charge, and if that fails, reckless endangerment might be their backup plan. Proving he messed with the crime scene is a walk in the park, considering he already confessed to smashing the security cameras. Hindering an investigation is straightforward, since he acknowledged ignoring a health crisis. Plus, they could definitely slap him with elder abuse. At 84 years old, she relied entirely on him for medical care and money management, making every single accusation incredibly serious. While all these offenses come with heavy jail time, they still don't solve the one mystery her loved ones desperately want answered. What happened to her? Behind closed doors at the courthouse, the rift tearing the relatives apart only grew wider. Savannah stayed mostly hidden from the media spotlight, though insiders noticed her attitude changing as the initial optimism faded into a grim reality. It turned into pure determination. While Tomaso's spouse, Annie, hasn't shown her face since releasing that initial press release. People close to the situation say she is stuck between a rock and a hard place. Accepting that her partner simply lost his nerve means admitting his cowardice killed her mom. On the flip side, trusting the detectives means accepting that the guy she tied the knot with committed an unforgivable act. When a family falls apart over a tragedy like this, it usually doesn't involve screaming matches. The breakdown is entirely silent. It's all about unreturned text messages, canceled holiday dinners, and deep connections that just fade into absolutely nothing. In the outside world, people stopped wondering about his guilt and started debating his eventual prison sentence, which is a massive psychological pivot. Rumors belong to the public, but indictments belong to the court. And right as the state laid out its case, a brand new twist emerged. Accountants digging into Nancy's banking history finally wrapped up their intensive audit. During the weeks before she vanished, nobody drained her savings, wired strange amounts, or frantically sold off her properties. This lack of suspicious activity pokes a hole in the standard greed theory. Though money isn't the only reason people snap, maintaining dominance is just as powerful. Terrified of losing the upper hand or simply harboring deep-seated bitterness, both work perfectly well as driving forces. Rumor has it the state might spin that heated chat about rewriting her will as the spark that turned a fight into fatal carelessness. The chronological breakdown shown to the panel hammered home a single crucial point. At 11:17 p.m., the elderly woman was still breathing. By 11:19 p.m., someone violently unplugged her heart monitor. And by 11:38 p.m., her son-in-law drove his car off the driveway. Nobody ever dialed for help. No paramedics were dispatched. And there's zero proof anyone tried to save her life. Assuming she was conscious when he showed up and breathing when the machine stopped, doing absolutely nothing is damning a concept lawyers refer to as an obligation to protect. Because he held her legal proxy and was standing right there in the room, he was technically required by law to step in and help. Standing by while someone suffers a health scare can easily turn into a felony, though his lawyers are already drafting their rebuttal. His team will claim he couldn't find a heartbeat, swearing up and down that he genuinely thought she was already gone. They'll argue that sheer terror messes with a person's head, heavily leaning on the fact that without physical remains, nobody can prove anything. They'll also constantly remind the jury that guessing is not evidence. While out in the field, detectives sneaked back to check out that dry riverbed. Law enforcement brought out the big guns, using heat-seeking flying drones designed to spot incredibly faint changes in the dirt. They also brought in highly specialized search dogs taught to sniff out the tiniest hints of human remains. They still came up empty-handed, meaning if whoever took her hid the remains, they did a brilliant job, leaving the cops with a chilling alternate theory. Is it possible she actually walked out the front door under her own power after the wires got pulled? Could she have stumbled blindly into the darkness, completely confused and barely able to stand? The search crews took another look at the path, noting that the hounds followed her smell right to the property line before hitting a dead end. You could guess someone tossed her in a trunk, or you could blame the weather for erasing the evidence. Strong Arizona winds can instantly blow away a tracking trail. Though off the record, the cops are pretty sure a car was involved. That quick little side trip caught on his truck's tracking system is still the most glaring red flag in this whole mess. His lawyers want their own tech guys to look at the location data, claiming a tiny 6-minute detour is just normal traffic maneuvering. The state, however, is absolutely convinced that was the exact moment he dumped the evidence. Everything happening with the grand jury is strictly confidential, but court insiders swear an indictment is coming soon. It might not be a homicide rap right out of the gate, but it'll be severe enough to turn a simple missing person hunt into a full-blown felony case. But the thing is, even if they actually bring a case against him, and even if a jury finds him guilty, a massive piece of the puzzle is still missing. They haven't found Nancy Guthrie. Without a body, getting any real sense of peace is just an illusion. The legal system just goes through the motions. Word is that Savannah confided in her inner circle, saying that figuring out what happened means way more to her than seeing someone locked up. She feels that bringing her mom home, regardless of her condition, would offer far more comfort than a harsh prison term ever could. Locals keep gathering to honor her memory. You can still see the glow of candlelight out in front of St. Philip's in the Hills Episcopal Church. Missing posters are still taped up everywhere. The cash bounty hasn't expired, and federal agents are keeping the investigation totally active. That's because no matter how the courtroom tactics shift, the core fact is exactly the same. An 84-year-old lady vanished into thin air. Someone violently ripped out her heart monitor. The crime scene was completely altered. Every single security lens was smashed to pieces. Meanwhile, the guy who confessed to being there when it all went down is sitting around, waiting to see if a panel of peers thinks he just freaked out or if he actually broke the law. That turning point in the courts is right around the corner. Getting formally charged isn't a guilty verdict, but it certainly makes a statement. It's a clear signal from the state that they've got enough evidence to back up their hunch. Heading into this next chapter of the investigation, one thing is absolutely certain. The quiet period is over. The clues have told their story. Confessions are finally on the record. Yet until someone locates Nancy Guthrie, dead or alive, this whole ordeal lacks an ending. Seeing as holding someone accountable doesn't mean much if she's still missing. Out there somewhere, lost amidst the digital heart readouts and the blowing sands of the Southwest, caught somewhere among the broken security feeds and medical device records, the real story is still hiding. The formal charges dropped right as the sun came up. There was no big theatrical arrest, no blaring sirens, and definitely no mob of journalists running after a cop car through a sleepy neighborhood. Rather, officials just opened up a private file at 8:17 in the morning down at the Pima County Superior Court. It read, "The State of Arizona against Tomaso." Interestingly enough, the allegations weren't what most folks predicted. They didn't hit him with a homicide accusation right out of the gate. The death penalty wasn't even on the table. Instead, the grand jury slapped him with involuntary killing, messing with a crime scene, hindering an investigation, and mistreating a senior citizen. Every single count painted a very specific picture. The manslaughter count signaled that the state attorneys figured Nancy Guthrie passed away even without a corpse to prove it, strictly because of his careless behavior. Meaning it wasn't a planned hit or a cold-blooded assassination, just a total lack of concern for her survival. Their courtroom argument was incredibly specific. Right at 11:19 at night, someone violently shut off Nancy's heart device. She was breathing perfectly fine at 11:17. Her heart started acting up terribly. She needed life-saving medical help right then and there. But rather than helping, Tomaso smashed the security lenses. He took off. He never even bothered to dial 911. And from the district attorney's point of view, that exact choice, that series of choices, is what ended her life. The evidence tampering charge stemmed from those broken surveillance devices. The obstruction count was all about him waiting so long to contact the authorities. The elder abuse allegation factored in her advanced years, her reliance on medical gear, and the fact that he was legally in charge of her life. Not having her physical remains didn't stop them from filing charges either. In this state, you can take someone to trial without a victim's body as long as the clues heavily point to a fatality and clearly show who caused it. The district attorneys essentially built their case around expert doctor opinions. Heart specialists took the stand during the secret hearings, explaining that an 84-year-old lady with Nancy's medical history wouldn't have lasted long at all once her device failed unless paramedics intervened immediately. They showed the jury all the wireless transmission logs. They also mapped out the crimson stains, hinting that she fell over right there in the house. They brought up the weird, out-of-the-way driving route he took, and the panel ultimately decided to press charges. Tomaso surrendered to the police a few hours later. He didn't put up a fight. He kept his mouth totally shut. He bailed himself out the very next morning. His time in front of the judge was super short. When they asked how he was pleading, he flat out said, "Not guilty." And in the blink of an eye, the whole situation shifted from cops looking for clues to lawyers gearing up for trial. However, moving the battle to the courthouse didn't answer the biggest mystery, seeing as a formal charge doesn't actually prove anything. It's basically just a claim backed up by a reasonable suspicion, and his legal team immediately started spinning their own version of events. In less than 48 hours, Tomaso's lawyers were talking to the media. They didn't try to argue that the medical device stayed on. They didn't pretend the security gear wasn't wrecked. What they did was flip the whole schedule of events. Their main point was that the state had zero proof Nancy Guthrie actually passed away in that residence, leaning hard on the fact that there's no coroner's evaluation, no post-mortem exam, no official timestamp for her passing, and absolutely nothing confirming what actually killed her. They hammered home the idea that she was still walking around after her heart freaked out. They used the crimson droplets to prove she was actively moving. They floated the theory that a confused and terrified Nancy might have just wandered right out the front door by herself. They totally challenged the idea that she was guaranteed to die just because the heart monitor got shut down. Doctors paid by the defense team claimed that certain people can actually stay alive for a little while without their implants running, provided their natural heartbeat isn't too chaotic. The defense team countered that the state was trying to prove murder using mere likelihoods instead of concrete facts. Plus, they kept circling back to a chilling reality. A murder charge is incredibly hard to stick without a corpse, insisting the prosecution could never fully erase all reasonable doubt. People were instantly divided over the news, with a portion of the crowd feeling this charge was a long time coming. Meanwhile, skeptics viewed the move as an overreach, fueled by heavy news coverage and community outrage. Savannah Guthrie issued a brief message via her legal representatives. She expressed that her relatives are still searching for answers, putting their faith in the justice system while prioritizing the safe return of their mom. Annie kept quiet in front of the press, while attorneys everywhere started using this situation to debate the limits of acceptable proof. Can digital data actually prove someone died? Should clinical guesswork ever replace a physical autopsy? Could blocking emergency responders seriously count as involuntary manslaughter? These exact debates will shape the entire courtroom battle, though the state is not done gathering their ammunition. Detectives are still digging into that suspicious 6-minute deviation out into the Badlands. Fresh dirt scrapings were pulled from the undercarriage of Tomaso's ride, and forensic teams are currently running the lab work. They managed to extract a tiny speck of botanical debris from beneath the car, and specialists are meticulously trying to link it to the brush growing out in the dry riverbed. However, even if the earth turns out to be a perfect match, that only confirms he drove through there, not that he actually dumped anything. Tomaso's lawyers have filed a motion to throw out the cardiac device logs, claiming the process of downloading the files could have messed with the digital timestamps. A judge has set up an initial hearing just to figure out if that information can even be shown to a jury. Should those heartbeat records make it into evidence, they will form the backbone of the state's entire sequence of events, but tossing them out would leave a massive hole in their argument. At the same time, authorities went back to the residence armed with cutting-edge three-dimensional scanning tech. Forensics built a complete virtual model of the splatter paths, mapped out fall trajectories, and figured out her step distance using the gaps between stains. Their simulation points to the victim losing complete physical mobility mere minutes after her device failed. Assuming their simulation stands up to intense questioning on the stand, the idea that she simply strolled off on her own falls completely apart. Nevertheless, lacking a physical corpse is still the biggest advantage for the accused. The men and women in the box need absolute proof that she is actually dead, that Tomaso directly brought about her demise, and that his behavior was dangerously negligent rather than just a tragic accident. Being dangerously negligent means you knew the hazards ahead of time, whereas a simple blunder suggests you honestly had no clue. That incredibly thin line is going to decide if he spends the rest of his life behind bars or strolls right out the front door. With courtroom prep officially kicking off, a fresh batch of summons has gone out. Nancy's personal lawyer received a subpoena to take the stand regarding their discussions about altering the will. Tech specialists are tearing through mobile data from that specific evening all over again, hunting for anything that might have been scrubbed. Detectives are also digging into online storage drives, trying to figure out if the victim recorded any audio clips or jotted down digital thoughts before everything went wrong. Meanwhile, the defense team is lining up folks to vouch for him, bringing in old university peers and buddies who will paint him as a highly organized, peaceful guy who could not hurt a fly. Good words from friends will not make those hard digital facts vanish, though, and those same electronic metrics can never tell us why someone did it. Right in the middle of this entire circus sits a massive void, a lady who vanished without a trace, an 84-year-old matriarch whose absolute last breaths are recorded exclusively through tech readouts and crimson stains. Bringing formal charges completely flipped the script, moving the conversation from what actually went down to what the state can factually back up. Lawyers are already tossing around calendar dates, and finding an unbiased panel of peers is going to be a nightmare. Early legal maneuvers will dictate exactly which pieces of proof ever make it to the public ear. Yet, even if a guilty verdict comes down and the judge hands over a harsh penalty, the darkest mystery hovering over this whole ordeal will not truly be settled until they actually locate her remains. Getting a legal win without bringing her back just leaves everyone feeling completely hollow. Right in the window between 11:17 at night and 11:38, inside an Arizona residence that used to be a sanctuary, a line was crossed that nobody could ever uncross. Figuring out if that turning point came down to sheer terror, severe negligence, or straight-up malice is no longer a matter of guessing. It falls squarely on the shoulders of 12 ordinary citizens weighing in on a mystery that finally burst wide open. The courtroom showdown kicked off exactly 8 months after she first went missing. At that point, the front-page frenzy had died down a bit, though the story never truly vanished from the public eye. The frantic media circus had chilled into a tense waiting game, and the gallery was absolutely packed to the brim on opening day. Journalists, television legal experts, locals who had organized candlelight vigils outside St. Philip's, plus random true crime junkies who got hooked the second that bizarre heart monitor detail hit the national news. Sitting right up front were the victim's kids. Savannah intentionally kept her distance from the press pool and kept her mouth completely shut. She just flanked her brother and sister, clasping her hands and staring dead ahead, while the accused walked straight into the room without casting a single glance their way. The state kicked off their opening remarks with one massive punchline. Back on February 1st, 2026, the man sitting at that table prioritized his own panic over basic human decency, and that exact decision directly ended the life of Nancy Guthrie. The attorneys guided the gallery step by step through the fateful night. 11:17 p.m. She was still breathing. 11:19 p.m. The heart device was violently shut down. By 11:38 at night, the accused drove away. He never dialed 911, smashed the security lenses, and just left the rear entrance wide open. Nancy had vanished without a trace. Prosecutors projected the pacemaker readouts for the jury, showing a jagged line as her heartbeat spiked, fluttered erratically, and ultimately dropped to a devastating 0. A heart specialist took the stand, explaining that for an elderly woman so entirely reliant on her cardiac implant, getting urgent medical help was a matter of life and death. Every single second counts, the doctor emphasized. Yet that precious window of time slipped away entirely wasted. The state presented a computer-generated simulation of the blood splatters, illustrating how the older woman most probably crumbled to the floor indoors the moment her implant was shut off. Prosecutors highlighted a 6-minute detour his car took by a dry desert ravine. Freaking out simply doesn't account for a diversion like that. Instead, the state insisted it showed a guilty conscience. True, authorities never recovered her remains. The prosecution owned up to that fact right away, insisting that a missing corpse doesn't automatically create reasonable doubt, especially when the clues paint such a clear picture. After that, it was the defense attorney's turn to speak. His legal team didn't bother trying to say he hadn't tampered with the medical device. Instead, they spun a completely different narrative around it. They painted a picture of absolute chaos and utter disbelief, an aging mother grabbing at her heart, while a son-in-law completely lacking any healthcare experience made an incredibly tragic, horribly flawed choice. The lawyers suggested the victim might have already been suffering a massive coronary event long before anyone laid a finger on the machinery. According to their theory, the sudden data surge at 11:17 that night could have just been a biological fluke. Furthermore, they pointed out smears in the blood evidence, proving she was actually moving around on her own. The defense attorney firmly stated that the woman was still breathing when his client drove off. He also made sure to remind the jury panel that authorities hadn't found a single trace of her. His side poked holes in the dirt samples taken from the defendant's tires, insisting that spending 6 minutes driving through a sandy subdivision hardly proves someone buried a corpse. His side brought out specialized witnesses to tear apart the state's medical theories, right before lining up people to vouch for his upstanding character. Co-workers painted Tomaso as a highly calculated, deeply intellectual guy who would never act on a reckless whim. Family acquaintances swore under oath that he had dedicated years to looking after his mother-in-law. Then came the turning point that completely altered the vibe of the courtroom. The accused walked up to the witness box. Nobody forced him to testify, yet he volunteered anyway. Keeping his voice low, he recounted the incredibly strained discussion over the family inheritance and the profound humiliation washing over him. The defendant walked the jury through, stepping back inside the residence, only to discover his mother-in-law collapsed on the ground. He openly confessed to shattering the security lenses. He claimed he was terrified, scared, stiff of being falsely accused, dreading the terrible optics, and absolutely horrified that he might lose his marriage, his good name, and his entire life. When the lawyers pressed him on why he never dialed 911, the silence that followed stretched out longer than at any other point in his testimony. "I honestly believed she had already passed away," he testified, "and I just completely lost my mind." During the grueling cross-examination, the district attorneys didn't let up. "So you just lost your mind," the prosecutor mocked. "And in the middle of this supposed freakout, your first instinct was to wreck the surveillance system instead of actually seeing if the woman had a heartbeat." The defendant stumbled over his words, and the tension in the room grew suffocatingly thick. The state's attorneys then circled back to their central, undeniable argument. Even if his freakout was entirely genuine, being scared simply doesn't give someone a free pass to walk away from their obligations. Assuming the elderly woman was still breathing when he walked in, and when her medical implant shut off, his absolute refusal to get help was what ultimately doomed her. The entire court proceeding dragged on for 3 excruciating weeks. Final statements boiled the whole ordeal down to a pair of clashing storylines. The district attorneys pushed a theory of extreme negligence. Meanwhile, the defense painted it as an incredibly heartbreaking accident. The 12 jurors hashed it out behind closed doors for 4 long days. When they finally filed back into the jury box, you could have heard a pin drop. Regarding the manslaughter accusation, they found him completely responsible for the death. As for altering the crime scene, guilty. On the count of getting in the way of a police investigation, also guilty. And for mistreating an at-risk senior citizen, convicted. Nobody clapped or even gasped. Instead, the heavy, inescapable reality of justice just seemed to blanket the entire space. The defendant stood there, completely stone-faced, while Savannah just shut her eyelids for a fleeting second. Annie simply stared at the floor. The formal penalty hearing got put on the calendar for the very next month, where the magistrate ultimately handed down a staggering 22-year stint behind bars. While handing down the punishment from the bench, the presiding official made a powerful point about basic human obligations. He noted that whenever a defenseless person is desperately relying on you during a medical emergency, the legal code mandates stepping up. Yet, the defendant opted to cover his tracks instead. Even with a guilty verdict, the family still didn't get their mother back. No corpse ever materialized throughout the legal proceedings, though the hunt for her went on under the radar. Search teams scoured that dry ravine 2 additional times. The original sniffer dogs got too old to work, so completely fresh canine units took their place, and the cash bounty for tips never expired. Decades started to slip by. The entire ordeal eventually turned into a textbook example for legal students, a masterclass on securing a murder conviction without a corpse, relying strictly on tech footprints and biological device readouts. It completely changed the way legal experts talk about a caretaker's liability, let alone how smart medical implants can be weaponized as proof in a courtroom. Savannah finally made her way back to her television career. She almost never brought up the nightmare in interviews, though every single year, on the exact date her mother vanished, she'd slip into St. Philip's Sanctuary. Votive lights were always burning in the aisles for her. The tragic tale of Nancy Guthrie absolutely refused to slip out of the collective consciousness of Tucson. Her legacy wove itself into the very soul of the community, serving as a chilling wake-up call about how fast a secure life can completely shatter. The courts had firmly wrapped up their end of the bargain. Yet the ethical debate was incredibly messy. Had the son-in-law genuinely plotted to end her life? The panel of 12 certainly didn't think it was premeditated. But did his terrible choices directly cause her to die? On that, they gave a resounding yes. Was there a tiny window between 11:17 and 11:19 that night where making a better call would have saved her? Without a doubt, the elderly woman vanished off the face of the earth on the 1st of February, 2026. The digital logs from her heart device ended up taking the stand as the ultimate observer. Meanwhile, the arrangement of her blood spatter provided an undeniable, wordless confession. The sheer fact that she vanished served as proof in itself. Even without ever locating her remains, the legal system decided that, however flawed it might be, someone had to answer for the crime. When all was said and done, the very quietness that originally kept Tomaso safe turned into the exact thing that sealed his fate in court. Out there, somewhere in the vast wastelands of Arizona, under changing breezes and an infinite horizon, the absolute physical reality of that evening likely remains hidden away. Yet in the eyes of the law, from an ethical standpoint, and across society, we now know exactly what went down within those walls in Tucson. It might not be a flawless or entire picture, but it was solid enough for a jury to decide. Nancy Guthrie was owed safety. She was owed compassion. She was owed someone dialing 911. She got absolutely none of those things. That massive failure to act beyond any other factor is what ultimately locked in this case. So, this is how the narrative finally wraps up, concluding with a guilty ruling, a few lingering mysteries, a household permanently transformed, alongside a stark realization that while the scales of the law might balance out without providing true peace of mind, they do eventually balance out anyway.
Behind the closed doors of a quiet home, we often believe that love and loyalty are the ultimate safeguards. But the haunting disappearance of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie serves as a chilling reminder of a profound moral truth. The greatest betrayal isn't always an act of malice. Sometimes it is the cowardice of a heart that refuses to help. This tragedy is a powerful lesson in the sacred duty of care. When a life flickers, especially that of an elder who has given decades to the fabric of our community, every second is a battlefield. To witness a heart fail and choose a cover-up over a phone call is more than a legal felony. It is a total collapse of human decency. We live in a world where silent witnesses like digital implants and crimson stains will eventually tell the truth. Let this be a call to action. Protect our elders. They are the keepers of our history, not obstacles to an inheritance or inconveniences in a moment of panic. Justice may be served in a courtroom, but peace is only found through integrity. Never let the fear of optics or personal loss silence your humanity. In the end, we are defined not just by the lives we lead, but by the help we provide when a beating heart depends on us the most.